Let's bring in right now the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. He joins us now. Thank you so much for being with us. With anxiety, depression, suicidal ideations, in extreme cases, suicide, being connected to excessive cell phone use, smartphone use for our children, talk about the importance of the warning labels that you want put on social media.
Well, thanks so much, Joe, and it's good to be with you and with Jen as well. My concern about social media dates back several years now to conversations I started having around the country with parents and with kids. And the most common question that I was getting was about social media. Parents wanted to know, is this safe for my kids? And last year when I issued an advisory on this topic, what I concluded were two things. One, that social media does not have enough evidence behind it to say that it's safe. So that question parents were asking, is it safe? The data does not support that it is. And instead, what we were seeing was growing evidence that there were harms, mental health harms associated with social media and our adolescents. So the bottom line is what we've got to do is ultimately make social media safer. And that's why I called on Congress to take a number of measures to protect kids from harmful content. That's violence and sexual content, bullying and harassment online, but also to protect them from features that would seek to manipulate their developing brains into excessive use. You know, right now, the average amount of use per day among adolescents is 4.8 hours of social media. And what we see in the data is that adolescents who are using 3 hours more per day face a doubling of risk when it comes to anxiety and depression symptoms. A warning label, which I called for earlier this week, would help warn parents about the risks that we see while we're waiting on Congress to ultimately make these platforms safer.
You know, just like Mr. Surgeon General, just like people that were working inside the tobacco industry in the 1950s understood the risks and tried to keep it from the public, we have very clear examples of, like, for instance, in the Meta study a few years ago that got leaked, that showed that people at Facebook understood that Instagram, in particular, did cause anxiety, added depression, suicidal ideations, especially for younger girls and women who used it. I mean, you can talk to people in Silicon Valley who limit their children's screen time because they understand that it sort of scrambles their brain or rewires their brain, shortens their attention span, adds anxiety and all these other things. I mean, the industry seems to understand this, do they not?
Well, this is a good question. And to really understand what the industry knows would require data transparency. And the problem right now is researchers are telling us that they have not been able to get access to all the information that the companies have about the mental health impacts of their products on our kids. Look, I'll say this, Joe. As a parent myself, I would never want to feel that the products that my children are using, that there's data about their safety that's being hidden from me. And the question I wonder about is, why is it that we are so, I think, fastidious, stringent, and conscientious about ensuring that we have safety data on other products that our kids use, whether it's cars that they get into when they're older, car seats, the food that they eat, the medications that they take. Yet when it comes to social media, a product which, by the way, 95% of kids are using, we have not required the kind of safety audits and independent studies that are needed to assess safety. So I do think that's a problem. It's one of the reasons I've called on Congress to require that kind of data transparency. It's why I think public audits are really important right now, because, look, I'd love to believe that what the companies are saying about the safety of the products is true, but we need proof, just like we demand with other products that kids use.
Surgeon General Al Sharpton, one of the things that comes to mind that I've had to deal with is that when you use cell phones in schools, we find that a lot of the fighting, the gangs, all of that use cell phones to do a lot of violent acts. So aside from the health issues that you've raised in terms of the labeling, is the fact that we could take the cell phones out of the schools, doesn't that bring down in some areas that many of us have to work with in terms of young people, it actually will stop a lot of the violence and a lot of the back and forth that leads to the kind of combating students against students?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Reverend, because look, if you talk to teachers in schools, as I have, they'll often tell you about what they're seeing, which is that using phones, and particularly using social media in schools, not only contributes to bullying and harassment, in some cases to violence, but it also distracts kids from learning. It impairs their ability to actually connect with one another and build relationships. I was visiting a school in Lincoln, Nebraska a few months ago, a school that had put in place a policy to restrict the use of phones during classroom time. And I asked the kids, how did you feel about that? And initially, some of them were uncertain about what the impact would be. But afterward, they said that they all really enjoyed getting to talk to one another and know one another. Some of them had been in school for a year or more together, but they hadn't actually built relationships with one another. When you create an environment where people can be without the distraction of social media all the time, what takes over is a natural instinct for us to connect with one another. And finally, just keep this in mind. If we listen to parents and young people on this issue, what the young people and parents are telling us is that they are concerned about the mental health impacts. Nearly half of adolescents are saying using social media makes them feel worse about their body image. This is what kids are telling us. A third of them are saying they feel addicted to social media. A third are saying that they're staying up till midnight or later on weeknights on their devices. Right. And everywhere I go in the country, kids say they can't get off of these devices. It's not by mistake. It's not because they don't have willpower. It's because the platforms are designed to maximize how much time they're spending on them. So the bottom line is this is a kid's issue.
Right.
We've got to put our kids' health and well-being first. That means taking action to make social media safer and warn parents and kids about the harms.
Right. I mean, it's a bit like casinos. Like they are designed to keep people on there. You talk to mental health counselors, they will tell you the more tired you are, the more likely you are to stay on these social media sites. And we need to let you go, but I just have to really quickly tie this to something else that a really important issue that you've talked about, and that is the epidemic of loneliness and isolation that is gripping America. You can't talk about that without talking about social media, without talking about technology, without talking about the things that are supposed to connect us, but as you just said, pull us apart.
Joe, I'll just very quickly say on that point, I finished a college tour recently talking to students about loneliness and isolation. The most common question they asked me, which is so disturbing, is they said, how are we supposed to build relationships with one another when the culture is no longer for people to talk to one another in person? This is partly a result of the social media culture that we have. We've got to rebuild social connection for young people, and in-person relationships are different from online relationships. They're richer. We need to cultivate them, and right now our kids are telling us that they need help in doing so. So addressing the harms of social media would be one step in the right direction.
And these two issues are so massively important, not only for our children, but for all of us. U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy, thank you so much for being here and for all that you're doing and coming.